Could thank Annie for her welcome there, and just make a few preliminary points before I get down to the meat of the matter. The title of the talk is Scottish Enlightenment in Ulster. And I chose that title because Enlightenment in Ulster wasn't limited to Belfast. Sometimes people speak of a Belfast Enlightenment, but it was much broader than that. There were dissenting academies in places like Crumlin and Strabane, so it was much broader than just Belfast. But for some reason or other, that term, Belfast Enlightenment, has started to appear. I think we need that broader perspective. And then, secondly, as regards to the word enlightenment, it seems to me that it can mean almost anything you want it to mean. Because when you go from country to country across Europe, it was different in every place. The context was different, therefore enlightenment was different. And here, as in Scotland, there was a particular context. Sometimes for some people, it has become a euphemism for the United Irishmen. They regard the United Irishmen and the 1798 rebellion as almost the zenith or the supreme embodiment of Ulster Enlightenment. I think that is something that perhaps does a bit of a disservice, both to Enlightenment and to the United Irishmen. It's more complex than that. And having made those preliminary remarks, I'll begin. The referendum on the Belfast Agreement was held on the 22nd of May, 1998. The count was on the Saturday, the 23rd of May. And that morning, the referendum dominated the newspapers, and so many other significant articles were almost overlooked. And one of them was an article by Maurice Hayes, who I'm sure everyone knew in some way or other. He was Permanent Secretary at Stormont, Chairman of the Community Relations Council, Secretary of Down GAA, Herder himself. And at the time of writing, he was a senator in the Republic of Ireland. He was also governor of the London Hall Library. So on all those fronts, a significant figure. And on that Saturday of the count, he contributed an article to the Irish Independent. In it, he looked back to the centenary celebrations of 1798, and in the course of his remarks, he made the following statements, which I might almost describe, not quite, as one of my texts for today. And I'll just put that up. Maybe it should carry a trigger warning. It is to Maurice Hayes, I said, I'm indebted for this. He said, throughout the decade from 1891 to 1898, the Irish Republican Brotherhood used the centenary of the United Irishmen to revive republicanism. And he said, these are the words of Maurice Hayes, another aspect of the centenary celebrations was to establish a theme that has sustained republicanism and anti-partitionism since, that Ulster Unionism was somehow an aberration, that the real identity of the Ulster Scot had been established and expressed in the men of '98, and that their descendants would ultimately recover from their temporary amnesia, or could be shocked into doing so, after which normal service would be restored. So if you didn't go down a particular line, he was saying you were treated as an aberration and someone suffering from temporary amnesia. That's why I said it might need to require a trigger warning. Maurice Hayes referred there to the Ulster Scots, so perhaps we should start by tracing, albeit very briefly, the story of the Ulster Scots. The waters between Ulster and Scotland, the North Channel, are often described as the Narrow Sea. And for much of human history, they were a bridge rather than a barrier. The Narrow Sea was a bridge that could be crossed in a few hours. It was a bridge across which many Scots crossed to Ulster, just as it was a bridge in the other direction. I maintain still that Patrick came to here from Scotland and that Columba then went in the other direction. So in all sorts of periods of history, people were going in both directions because it only took a few hours. And people and ideas crossed that sea time and time again. The Whig historian G.M. Trevelyan stated that the connection between West Scotland and the northeast of Ireland is a constant factor in history. Professor Finlay Holmes said that history and geography have combined to make Ulster as much almost as Scottish as an Irish province. And so we've ended up with a situation where here, in this place we call home, we have really three traditions. There's an English tradition, there's a Scottish tradition, and there's an Irish tradition. And they all meet here. This is the point where they come together. You can see it reflected if you go to Downpatrick, bottom of the street there, below the cathedral, down on the hill, traffic lights and three streets meet. At one point, English Street, Irish Street, and Scotch Street. Perfect example of that mixing and melting together here in Ulster. I noticed Dame Marlene Foster a while ago referred to her example from Fermanagh as being Brookborough, where it was the Brooke family who were English, Maguire's Bridge, the Maguire family who were Irish, and Irvinstown because the Irvins were Scottish. It's another way of looking at it. And you get this right across the country time and time again. Wolfe Tone picked it up when he spoke of Protestant, Catholic, and Dissenter, three traditions. William Drennan worded it slightly differently when he said Churchman, Presbyterian, and Catholic. So it's worth looking just at that map on the screen for a moment. As we go back to the Hamilton and Montgomery settlement 1606, the foundational story of the Scots in Ulster, and it predated in 1606 both the plantation of Ulster and the flight of the Earls. And so we see the emergence in 1606 of an Ulster-Scots people. A review of the Ulster-Scot, the book that was written in 1914 by J.B. Woodburn, appeared in the Times on the 30th of April, 1914. And the reviewer said, he is a mystery, this Ulster-Scot. All other peoples Ireland tends to absorb. Now, that was obviously a reference back to D.P. Moran and his Irish Ireland, where he said the Gael must be the element that absorbs. And somehow there were people who didn't quite fit in with that. Tom Devine makes the interesting point when he's describing that early settlement here. He says, the Scots who made the move to Ulster seem to have been a relatively balanced cross-section of the national population. The upper end of the scale, landowners, substantial tenants, saw the venture as an opportunity for economic advancement. Below this elite class, a broad social spread of artisans and labourers, farm servants and cottars, and significantly, for every 4 men, 3 women moved to Ulster. So it was an important influence, he said, which helped to maintain the distinctive identity of the Ulster Scots. We saw in the previous slide there the way in which the folk came from certain regions in southern Scotland, particularly the southwest, but also right across that Midland belt, a little bit in the east, and then settled in Antrim and Down. This was an Antrim and Down settlement before the plantation. I hope you can, oh yes, there's readable. It's interesting there just to look at maybe the fact that whilst the initial plantation of Ulster, 1609, 1610, involved both English and Scottish settlers, the English, when they came, quite often didn't stay. It wasn't a place that appealed to them. It was a harsh climate. It wasn't the most productive ground at times. The Scots were different. They were harder. They were thrawn. They stuck at it. And so it was that more and more came and the numbers were filled up again and again. Hamilton Montgomery, the flight of the Earls, the plantation, 1609. And then, of course, James wanted rid of those troublesome reaver clans along the Scottish-English border. They were a pain. They were breaking the law. They were causing great difficulty. So he just, well, he hung a lot of them. Disposed of them in that way, and others were sent across to Fermanagh. And you have them still there. The Armstrongs, the Elliots, and the Johnsons are the 3 most common names in the Protestant community in Fermanagh to this day. Armstrong, Elliot, and Johnson, just look at the names above shops in Fermanagh, and the most common name in the Catholic community is Maguire, still. Nixons and Elliots, Johnsons, many other names, Crozier, all sorts of names that go back to that period. The transportation of the reavers brought many across. There's another event then that happened in 1625, and that was a 6-mile water revival, which was an amazing religious revival at that time that was particularly amongst the Scottish Presbyterian settlers. There was just one English Puritan involved, but largely Scottish Presbyterians And that 1625 revival that ran from Carnmoney and down even to Carrick and across, in fact, the loch over to Bangor, that stretched all the way up there to Antrim. That 6 Mile of Water revival embedded Scottish Presbyterianism in Ulster. The Earl of Antrim, he had 340,000 acres of land, the largest Catholic landowner in Ulster at the time, and he brought over Scottish lowland settlers who were Protestant to settle on his land because they knew they would make good tenant farmers. The Ulster Massacre of 1641 took many people away, but the arrival of a Scottish army of 10,000 men in February 1642 under Major General Robert Monroe, one of whose descendants was a leader of the United Irishmen then in Lisburn. But General Monroe came over with an army of 10,000 men, and so more Scots were coming. And they organised the first presbytery in Carrickfergus in 1642. And so not only was a situation where Presbyterians were embedded, but it was organised by 1642. There were the killing times in Scotland when Covenanters were punished for their faith. And the result was, again, some found shelter in Ulster and some stayed. The next big event for them was, of course, the Siege of Londonderry then in 1688, 1689. But it's the decade after that that's particularly important for this, because in the decade after 1690, you had 7 years in Scotland when there was famine, there was considerable depopulation, and there were people moving away all sorts of places. Starvation, emigration, depopulation. 15% of the population was lost at that time. And in some areas it was as high as 25%. It was the Little Ice Age, 7 years of really cold weather across Europe. I don't know what that has to do with global warming, but I'm sure there's some connection somewhere. And then again, after the 1745 Jacobite rebellion, more Scots came. Interesting, because I was out the other day at Sentry Hill, the McKinney house there at Ballycraigie. And I hadn't realised before, it was a mixed marriage. One was a Jacobite, one was a Hanoverian. They were both Presbyterians, but because it was a mixed marriage politically, they had to leave Scotland and they came over and settled eventually at Carnmoney and made their home, eventually the family, at Sentry Hill. So there was this constant flow of Scots across, right up to the end of the 17th century. In 18th century, now we're getting to the period that's the focus of what I wanted to say today. In 18th century Ulster, things were not so good for those Presbyterian Ulster Scots. You had in 1704 the Sacramental Test Act, something that is almost forgotten. I can recall in 2004 proposing in Belfast City Council at the time that they should have some sort of commemoration of the Test Act to mark the 300th anniversary, and most people looked around and said, "What's that?" But if you remember, William III had died in 1702. He was succeeded by Queen Anne, and the Parliament that was there at that time, the powers that be in Dublin, passed an unrepresentative and undemocratic Parliament passed the Test Act in 1704. It's interesting, if you look there in the picture, it's a picture of First Derry Presbyterian Church. And beside it is a memorial which is at the front entrance to the church. It's a list of the names of people who suffered as a result of the Test Act. The Test Act was, of course, that to hold public office, whether in Parliament, in councils, to hold any civic office at all, you had to have a sacramental test card, essentially a certificate that said that you had taken communion in the Church of Ireland. Now, it penalised both Presbyterians and Roman Catholics, but the people who really suffered the most from it, from that particular piece of legislation, were the Presbyterians, because they were so well represented on councils and boroughs across Ulster. And those are the ones who had served on the Corporation of Londonderry, who were then removed because they refused to take communion in the Church of Ireland. They were people who held faith very strongly. I think one of the things that's important in understanding this period is to recognise how strongly people felt about religious matters. It's different. It's harder for people to understand it today. I was looking at an article that Eilish O'Hanlon had written in the Irish Sunday Independent there in regard to a particular individual who's been some controversy in the Republic recently. And she said, it's hard for secular society to understand people like that because it's almost foreign to them. And that's the point here again, the strength of commitment and belief that those folk had. Interestingly enough, one of the people who's on the list, he's the first of the sheriffs to be named, was David Kearns. He was a barrister, the first of the gentry to arrive at the siege in 1688. He organised the defence. He was sent to seek help from William III. And now he was being barred from public office in the city that he had helped to preserve. You can understand why there was resentment about that. There was some improvement slightly in 1719 with the Toleration Act, but really a lot of these penalties that impacted on Presbyterians were still there right into the 19th century. Presbyterian weddings were not recognised for a very long time. The tithes had still to be paid even to the Church of Ireland, even though you weren't a member and didn't attend, you still had to pay your tithe. So all of these things caused resentment amongst the Ulster Scots at that time. Barred from public office and participation at the highest level in society, they turned to other things. And the three things I think particularly stand out for me are enterprise, emigration, and education. Those were things that were open to them in their own way. Enterprise, certainly. If you look at that period of the 18th century and look at the progress economically and the entrepreneurial spirit was part of their thinking. 6 days shalt thou labour and do all thy work. They were determined to make sure they packed plenty into those 6 days because it was to them an act of faith. It was as much a responsibility for them to labour for 6 days as to rest themselves. The two belong together. They also, I suppose you can refer back to that old phrase about the Protestant work ethic, which I would say was almost a Calvinistic work ethic. But nevertheless, there was that entrepreneurial spirit, enterprise, emigration. From 1718 onwards, many of them, faced with all sorts of issues, emigrated. And in 1718, the stream of emigration became a flood. From 1718, large numbers were crossing. There are different views as to the exact number, but somewhere in the region of 200,000 people. That's a lot of people. 200,000 people across the Atlantic, probably by the time of the War of Independence in America. That stream was fed by religious discrimination. It was also fed by famine and poverty, because if you look at the years of immigration, they were highest in the years when there was a famine and there was hunger. They were also impacted by rack renting. Landlords who were charging extortionate, unscrupulous rents. And the result was, again, there was a large movement across the Atlantic. You just wonder what would have happened if it had been different, if 200,000 of them had stayed here, what impact that would have had. And on the other side of the Atlantic, if 200,000 hadn't gone over, what impact that would have had on the War of Independence. And we'll return to that. Which brings us then to the other area, and that was, of course, education. Trinity College Dublin was close to them, and so they went to Scottish universities, principally Glasgow, where they absorbed Scottish ideas. There was an Ulster-Scottish world of ideas and influences that crossed the narrow sea. And as well, ministers in some places set up dissenting academies. It's a phrase that maybe isn't quite as much in vogue today, but it's an important phrase. And dissenting academies as well in England, amongst the non-conformists and dissenters there, were hugely important. They provided a high-quality education. And you had, as I've said already, there are examples in Crumlin and Strabane. Interesting enough too, if you look at the people who were going over to study there, particularly ministers went over to study theology in Glasgow. Dr. Liam McFarlane has looked at the educational background of all of the ministers who were involved in the 1798 rebellion. And of the 7 probationers who were involved, she says we can only identify the educational background of 6, all 6 trained in Glasgow. Of the ministers, she identified 17 who trained in Glasgow and 2 who trained in Strabane. The Strabane one is interesting. The minister there who ran the academy was the Reverend William Crawford, who was of the same family as Major Fred Crawford of the Larne gun running. So an interesting family story there and an interesting background, and one that Crawford did not shy away from. That Reverend William Crawford, as I say, was in Strabane. He ran the Ascending Academy. It was only one of many. It brings us then a little bit further on in the 18th century. And it was a turbulent time. Sometimes people look at, well, Williamite Wars and Glorious Revolution, United Irishmen, Rebellion, it was peace between. Maybe not quite as peaceful, depending on where you lived. There was a lot of turbulence. And I put up there 2 sides to that. One is an agrarian example. The agrarian one I've taken there as being the Hearts of Steel, who were country folk, Protestant, largely Presbyterian. And there's a story that's often told about them there, where in those years between 1769 and 1772, they campaigned against exorbitant rents, unjust rents, and various other issues. They used a bit of, I use the term paramilitary, almost paramilitary violence, because they threatened them to cause damage to the property of the landlords. That was their way of dealing with it. You get the same with the Land League in the next century as well. One of them got arrested, a man called David Douglas. He was brought into Belfast and put in jail for what he had done. He'd been injuring the cattle that belonged to the landlord, who was a bit unscrupulous. And on the particular day in question, the 23rd of December 1770, there was a body of Hearts of Steel, steel men, who gathered at Temple Patrick. At which point I should have been a bit sensible and switched my phone off. Particularly since it's only a wife. We'll actually switch it off properly in case something else happens. Yes. This could be bad. We can't get switched off. The 1,200 of them gathered up. They started at Temple Patrick Meeting House, the old meeting house there, non-subscribing one at Temple Patrick. They got their swords, their pitchforks, and their guns, and headed off for Belfast to rescue their friend David Douglas. On the way, they picked up some more. They arrived here, they attacked the jail, they threatened to burn down the house of one L. Cunningham, which was at Castle Junction. It was one of the speculators that was charging an exorbitant rent, and they demanded the release of David Douglas, who was duly released, not surprisingly, when you have 1,200 armed men gathering in Castle Junction. The interesting thing about that is, they came from County Antrim. And where did they gather in 1798? Temple Patrick. Gathered at Temple Patrick. There were guns that were being stored under the floor of a building at Temple Patrick, and they headed off for Antrim. What strikes me is that those of these things, in regard to the examples I give in terms of the Hearts of Steel, is that they were both connected with Antrim and Down. The countries, or the counties rather, which were to the fore when it came to the United Irishmen. And so people who had gone out armed in 1770 or thereabouts, it wasn't such a big thing to appear again in 1798. There was a tradition that had emerged there. There was a pattern they were used to. The other example in County Down was at Guildford, where again there was a similar sort of situation. Unfortunately, there the local Presbyterian minister betrayed them and let them be known that they were planning some activity, and it was unsuccessful. But the Hearts of Steel in Antrim and Down, and then elsewhere, about agrarian issues. In the case of Armagh, it was partly agrarian because it was battle about land, but it was also sectarian. It was Protestant and Catholic, and you had the defenders who were Roman Catholic. You had the Peep of Day boys, who were Protestant, in many cases Presbyterian. And that leads you to the Battle of the Diamond and the formation of the Orange Order, 1795. It's often said that the Orange Order in its early years was largely, exclusively Church of Ireland. Now, there's a sense in which you could argue that it was taken over and established more by the Church of Ireland, by the landed gentry who would tend to be Church of Ireland. But the people who set up the Orange Order after the Battle of the Diamond in September 1795 were all Presbyterians. In fact, when you look at it, they actually were, the key figure there was a man called James Wilson, who was a Presbyterian farmer from the Dian in County Tyrone. So not all the Presbyterian Ulster-Scots were in sympathy with the United Irishmen. There were others who were sympathetic to the Orange Order. And I say that because I've often listened to talks where people say, oh, the Presbyterians were this or the society, history, full of contradictions, full of conflicts, full of changes. And the truth was that there was no single solitary view that you could ascribe to the Presbyterians at that time. I say that because I think, and I say this in passing, I'm interested in that period, and I think it's important to understand all of the complexities of it. I can remember back in 2009 being in the Department of Culture, Arts and Leisure, and they were opening the Ulster Museum. It had been refurbished, opened eventually in October, and I was shown around by one of the civil servants who was there with me, a group of civil servants in fact, and officials. And there was a civil servant who was running ahead. And he got around a corner to the next part of the exhibition. And I was following it through year after year from ancient times, plantation, and so on. And he said, he came running back in a state of concern. He said, Minister, I have to tell you something. All right, well, what was it? What is it? He said, they've left something out. Oh, right. What have they left out? And he said, well, they've got the volunteers, they've got the United Irishmen, but they've forgotten about the Orange Order. And it struck me strange. Well, what they did in the end was shove the other two cabinets apart, and they shoved an extra wee bit in to fill it up. But it was pathetic because it had no artifacts at all, and if I'm going to a museum, I want to see artifacts. We've talked there of enterprise, emigration, education. Brings me then, moving on to, your battery is running low. At which point, I will pull out a plug. You will put that in. I will connect that in there, and hopefully we'll be well. Correct. That's okay. I've come there to look at William Ritchie's picture. There is the next one that I put up. He came here in 1791. So period 1791, 1798, Enlightenment era, United Irishmen at the end of that period. William Ritchie came in 1791. He brought with him 10 men, materials, apparatus, equipment, a younger brother, Hugh Ritchie, and they set up the first shipyard in Belfast. They came from Saltcoats. And so instead of ships being made in Scotland brought over here, they were made here. And he took the lead on it. He brought over other families. There's a family called Connells, a family called McLeans, and they were all into shipbuilding. And another brother, another of the Ritchies, came over as well later. He joined the second Presbyterian congregation in Rosemary Street, which, like the first one, was non-subscribing. It was the third congregation, was the one that was Trinitarian. But he joined the second congregation in Rosemary Street, of which he was a member then for the rest of his life, and committed his life to numerous literary, scientific, and charitable institutions, including the General Hospital and the Royal Belfast Academical Institution. So we see there somebody who was committed to industry, but was also of that Enlightenment character, who saw the value of education, thinking, learning, studying, wanting to know, and like others of his ilk there, very much committed to issues around equality and democracy. The last decades of the 18th century were certainly times of great progress and change. You have the Belfast Charitable Society there, the poorhouse. You have the Belfast Academy being set up also by Reverend James Crombie, who was one of the ministers of the First Presbyterian Church in Rosemary Street. You have the Lindenhall Library here in 1788. And then by 1792 and 1797, you have the Belfast Fever Hospital. The city to which they came, or the town to which they came, was very much an Ulster-Scots town. When Amias Griffith from Cork came to Belfast to work in the customs, he said, "The common people speak broad Scotch, and the better sort differ vastly from us, both in accent and language." He was writing back to one of the landed gentry in Cork. 1797, Chevalier de la Tocquenay had escaped from France because of the rebellion, came here, and in 1797 he published in 1797, 2 previous years, he did a tour of Ireland, because I have nothing better to do, he said, which isn't really what you expect or want them to say. But anyway, he said this: "Belfast is almost entirely the look of a Scotch town, and the character of the inhabitants has considerable resemblance to that of the people of Glasgow. The way of speaking is much more Scots than Irish." And so you have an Ulster-Scots town with a lot happening and a time of change. Which brings me now to the Scottish Enlightenment. And one of the key figures in that undoubtedly was Francis Hutcheson. Philip Ward did a very, very good talk on Francis Hutcheson for the library just a couple of weeks ago, and it was very, very enjoyable. A man who was born at Drumalig into a Presbyterian family, grew up in St. Field, trained in one of these academies, went to the University of Glasgow, studied there, went as a teacher to Dublin, mixed with radicals in Dublin. In fact, William Drennan's father was part of that connection as well. He was a professor at Glasgow University, although he'd done most of his writing when he was a young man still in Dublin. And eventually he happened by chance to die in Dublin when he was visiting. What are the things that stand out when you look at Hutcheson and those of the Scottish Enlightenment? And I said, it's very hard to pin down, because you could look at Immanuel Kant on the continent, his thinking. You can look at every area, and it's different. In fact, the word enlightenment doesn't appear in the English language in this way until the end of the 19th century. So you're actually talking a century afterwards. There have been similar words in French and German, but it only appears in English 100 years later. What are you talking about? You're talking about issues around education and learning. You're talking about equality. You're talking about liberty, the rights and inalienable rights, democracy, the right to resist. The common good, the greatest happiness for Hutcheson cannot be found in wealth and external pleasures, but virtue is the chief happiness in the judgment of all mankind, which is sort of forerunner of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. That sort of utilitarian look at life, that philosophy that they espouse, holds that public policy should aim at greater happiness for a greater number of people. Now, there is sometimes a suggest these ideas emerged at that time in Enlightenment. But I would suggest to you they've been around a lot longer than that. A lot longer. These were folk who did not necessarily agree on everything. You see, Hans Sloane from Killaloe has been described as one of those who launched the Enlightenment. Yet there were sides to his character which by modern standards would be seen as unenlightened, in particular his view on the treatment of slaves. So just to suggest to some degree that everything was beautiful and it was simple and everybody agreed, no, they didn't. And there were disputes amongst many of those involved in the Enlightenment. But just think of those things that I've said there, they were associated with it. They were around for a long time. These were people who were brought up in a Presbyterian faith. They knew their Bible, knew the Old Testament as well as the New. Maybe they knew the Old Testament better than the New. Seek the peace or the welfare of the city. whether I have caused you to be carried away captives. Jeremiah, seek the welfare of the city. Interesting. What does God require you? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That idea of doing justice, the welfare of the city, those were ideas that they had absorbed already from the scriptures. And it brings me then also to others who had ideas of nature. John Knox. You look there at John Knox, and the great Scottish reformer, in many ways the maker of Scotland, some would argue. And one of the things that he was very keen on was education. And he promoted the idea of an education system that would be primary, secondary, and tertiary. He wanted an educated people. He believed that that was right. God gave us a mind, he needs us to use it. We should be educated. Obviously, that included studying the scriptures for John Knox, but the important idea was an educational learning. I'm also interested in equality and democracy. And I took as an example there Andrew Melville, who, as you'll see on the screen there, was the scourge of bishops, didn't like them too much, and the chief architect of Presbyterianism in Scotland. He called King James VI of Scotland God's silly vassal. I can just imagine somebody today going up to a president and to a monarch, God's silly vassal. He didn't hold back in what he said. These were not fearful people, they were fearless, in fact. And he actually says, in this country, there are two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of God, the Kirk, and there's the kingdom of men. You're head of the kingdom of men, but when it comes to the kingdom of God, you're just a member like anybody else. Wow. Because for Presbyterians, that was the case. The wealthiest member of the congregation has one vote when it comes to the elders, the same as the poorest member of the congregation. You can have as many titles as you want, as many degrees as you want, it doesn't matter. You've got one vote the same as everybody else, and we'll all get together in the light. Go back and read John Dunlop's A Precarious Belonging, which is an excellent illustration or exposition of that type of thought. They believed in democracy, they believed in equality, you voted. They also believed in the right to resist. Long before Hutchison. If you go back to James VI of Scotland, he came to the throne when he was 13 months old. So he wasn't really ruling. He had regents who looked after him and ruled for his behalf. And he was sent to be tutored by a man called George Buchanan. Buchanan was his teacher, but in the end, James didn't like George. Why? Because James believed in the divine right of kings. And George said, you are wrong. We have the right to resist. And there was friction between the two. You can get an even better example. You come to Samuel Rutherford. And if you're ever over in Scotland going from Stranraer, boat across, and you get to Port Patrick or Stranraer, as the case may be, and you're heading towards Dumfries, do stop at a place called Anmouth. There's the ruins of a little church there. There's a plaque up that says Anmouth Old Kirk, and the minister was Samuel Rutherford, one of the greatest of the Covenanters. Not only was he a theologian and a pastor, but he was also a poet, and some of his lines were used later in the hymns, such as this, the sands of time are sinking, the dawn of heaven breaks. Great man, Samuel Rutherford, well worth a visit. Most people here know nothing about him. Drive past, there's a huge memorial, as well as the memorial on the church. There's over the Gatehouse of Fleet is where it's at. There's this huge pillar that was put up there as an obelisk, as a reminder of him. And if you look at the bottom, it says he stood for civil and religious liberty. You see, for these people, liberty came before loyalty. Liberty was of supreme importance. Rutherford was also the author of a 300-page volume called Lex Rex. It's heavy going. 300-page volume, Lex Rex, which basically means the law and the prince or the king. It's considered one of the greatest books on political philosophy ever written. Samuel Rutherford's teaching argued against the doctrine of the divine right of kings. He promoted equality under the law, including kings. He believed in inalienable rights, which is one of the hardest words to say, I find. Government by consent, separation of powers, and the right to resist and revolt against lawful authority. Long before Hutchison. If you remember there, this was a man who, in 1644, he wrote Lex Rex, 50 years before you get to Hutchison and his birth. So these were influences that were there in Presbyterian Ulster-Scots before the Enlightenment. One of the things that comes out of that, of course, is Ulster and the American Revolution, because it was the Ulster influence that really, I think, ultimately was one of the determining factors in the revolution. Professor Crawford Gribben of Queen said, Ulster Presbyterians were given a surprising political education, an American Revolution. It's a quote that, something of that nature, it was also said, Professor Finlay Holmes, Presbyterian, their experience was deeply politicizing. They were radicalized, in a sense, by the American Revolution. It was the American Revolution, much more than the French Revolution, that shaped Ulster-Scots Presbyterianism. They were people who had sent ideas across. Yes, Francis Allison from the parish of Leck there in Donegal was tutor to a number of people who signed the American Declaration of Independence, including, of course, he was also the tutor to Charles Thompson of Maharana, who was the secretary of the Continental Congress. But there were others as well who were educated. He taught Thomas McCain, whose parents were from Ballymoney, and James Smith, another of the signatories. So you have that influence going on. Actually, it wasn't the only influence. There were Covenanter influences in the American Revolution. One of the addresses of the Scottish Irish Congress was John Knox in the Hall of Liberty. But they look back to John Knox. They look back to all these things, these American revolutionaries. There's a wonderful book written in the centenary of the American Revolution in 1876, where one of the writers refers back to the fact that the Ulster influence came through in a whole lot of ways. And one of the writers actually says that his grandmother had grown up in County Down. She had taught her daughter, his mother, and his mother taught him. And what did she teach him? She taught him about the Siege of Derry and a man called Claverhouse, who was one of the persecutors of the Covenanters in Scotland. He says, those were the things that my mother grew up on, because her mother, who was from County Down, taught them generation. This was folk memory. This was tradition being passed on. It's not the sort of thing you'll find in official documents or anything like that, but it's a folk memory. Ulster and the American Revolution. What influence did those radical ideas have? Well, they were largely influencing the elite in the north. They were the people who were going to be taught by Allison and others. They were the people who might read Hutchison and his writings that had been carried across the Atlantic. But I'll argue this with you, that the American Revolution wasn't one in the north, it was one in the south. It was one in the south for this reason. When you come down there to 1780, the Battle of King's Mountain, the people who turned the war in many ways were not the elite who had read the tracts of Payne or Hutchison or someone else up in those cities in the north. They were people who had actually learned very little of these things, but they were frontiersmen whose minds were influenced by Knox, by Rutherford, by other Presbyterians, and the right to resist they knew about. They had fought against, as sisters had fought against James in the War of Derry. Why not fight against George and the Hanoverians? You've done it once. And so those frontiersmen, in many ways, the Redcoats could not deal with them because they didn't fight according to the normal rules of war. They fought more like the Indians whom they had contact with. And so I think the influence there is much different from what is often suggested. The French Revolution influence here. Thomas Paine, well, before that, I'll just mention the French Revolution itself there. Storming of the Bastille, 1789, marked the start of the French Revolution, which lasted to 1799. And during the year of the Reign of Terror, somewhere in the region of 17,000 people were killed. It's often, I seem to have lost one of them, never. It's often said that the United Irishmen volunteers celebrated the French Revolution, and they did. 1791, 1792, there were parades in Belfast. No doubt about that, they did. But when you get to 1793 and the Reign of Terror, and you find out that people whom you've been supporting had killed 17,000 people, puts a different side to the picture. Interestingly enough, the Belfast volunteers were celebrating that. In Ballymena, what were the Ballymena volunteers celebrating? They didn't turn out in July for the French Revolution, they turned out in November. And they had their parade on the 4th of November because that was the birthday of William III. So different parts of the volunteer movement were different. It's not the simple, solitary, solid picture that is often portrayed, much more complex. They were celebrating William of Orange, they were celebrating the French Revolution, they were all volunteers. The other thing I find interesting in a lot of this, and I'll put it up, I think it's the next one, hopefully. Oh, there's the two parades there, wrong order. The other person that's very interesting in that period is Thomas Paine. And much is made of the fact that he is supposed to have said, or sorry, that Wolfe Tone is supposed to have said that Thomas Paine's writings, The Rights of Man, were the Quran of Belfast. Now, I think Marianne Elliott's coming here in a few weeks to give a lecture, so I got a chance to ask her there. I looked through the memoirs of Wolfe Tone and the diary, and I can't find that quote there. Now, it's probably somewhere else. Somebody will tell me this. But Wolfe Tone may have said it's the Quran of Belfast, as though everybody here was devouring Thomas Paine. I don't think that's the case. And I just make two observations. A lot of the claims that are made at that time, you find. Oh, sorry, I thought I'd put it up. There it is. Ulster Journal of Archaeology, 1905, Francis Joseph Bigger, who's writing in to ask, we're supposed to have been printed in Belfast 30,000 copies of Thomas Paine's Age of Reason for free distribution. Does anybody know where that fact comes from?
Nothing published till nothing published themselves.
No, it was a lot of things were published. That in Belfast.
Later, I think 1795.
Oh yeah, all I'm saying just it was I made the point. It's the point that Bigger was saying there. There are things that are said, and are they necessarily the full picture? I would be interested in finding out a bit more about the Quran of Belfast quote. Interesting enough, in 1796, Wolfe Tone said about the Age of Reason by Paine, damn trash. Now, if you thought the man wrote trash, and he then spends a whole paragraph excoriating Paine. It's also the case that, and I'll come to the next one, Society of United Irishmen, you see William Drennan there on the left, and you see there the Battle of Ballynahinch on the right. I'm not going to go into all of the history of the United Irishmen because it's more than one talk in itself. But I'll just say this. It's interesting to look back at one of the best sources for that period, and that is the writings of the Weaver poets. Because that was not the writings of an elite in Dublin or in Belfast. They were the ordinary people. And what's clearly coming through in many of these is there was a great sense of regret and disappointment. Best expressed by James Campbell of Ballymuir, who was arrested in 1798, had most of his poetry taken away and destroyed, but he wasn't charged or put in prison. He says this, in 98, we armed again, to right some things that we thought wrong. We got sae little for our pains, it's no worth minding in a song. Disappointment. It had all fallen apart. Francis Bole, another of the Weaver poets, my friends, be admonished no more to rebel. Its dreadful effects there's no poet can tell. It desolates countries, proves nations o'erthrow, brings men to the scaffold like General Monroe. Interesting also to see how they identified themselves. Here's a quote from Samuel Thompson, the Bard of Carngrana, where he says, "Indeed, fate seems to have mistook the spot at first designed for me, which should have been some flowery nook in air or on the banks of Dee. I love my native land, no doubt, attached to her through thick and thin, yet though I'm Irish all without, I'm every item Scotch within." The inner man, the heart of the man, the inner being, was embedded in that Presbyterian Ulster-Scots tradition. He's also got a later poem where he excoriates Thomas Paine, which is significant. Which brings me then to, just as the reign of terror in France had turned many of the rebels against rebellion, Scullabogue had a long-lasting effect afterwards. Whatever the fine details, we know certainly that the most accurate figure, 126 people were murdered at Scullabogue, men, women, and children. 116 were Protestants, 10 were Roman Catholics who were servants or labourers associated with Protestant farmers. It's interesting. Almost forgotten. There's one wee tiny memorial in Wexford's full of memorials to 1798. And one wee tiny, it's hidden away in a Church of Ireland graveyard, and you could spend half a morning trying to find it. Almost forgotten. But that had an impact. And so it was that the rebellion in 1798 came to an end. Tens of thousands of combatants were killed. People forget about that. They speak about the United Irishmen as though it's all soft and cuddly. We love each other. That's the impression that sometimes comes across. And I should say, I've listened to about 6 lectures on this period over the last couple of weeks, because I've heard it from a feminist perspective, from a socialist perspective, and from a Republican socialist perspective, and a Workers' Party perspective, and a communist perspective. I've heard them all the different perspectives. Truth of the matter is, it came to nothing. And just as James Campbell said, it's no worth mine, we got nothing out of it. Much of that they hoped to achieve through rebellion, they got through the Act of Union, which came into effect in 1801. There was the abolition of an unrepresentative parliament in Dublin. And the result was that when it came to 1803 and Robert Emmet supported rebellion, there was no support here for that. The only thing that they didn't get at that time that they wanted was Catholic emancipation. That took a few more decades. But nevertheless, much of what they wanted to achieve was achieved at that time through the Act of Union, unintended consequences. Brings me then, and I've no watch, so I have no idea what time it is. I'm about to stop. You'll be glad to hear. I started off by quoting Maurice Hayes, and this is where I think the problem arises. And he got his finger right on it. In 1898, a man called Robert Johnson lived in a big house on the Antrim Road. His next door neighbour was Belfast Castle, but he was the head of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ulster, main organisation. And Robert Johnson had joined the Molly Maguires, he had joined the Fenian movement, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He was a very wealthy businessman, timber merchant, and various other things. He played a leading role in using 1891 to 1898 to revive the IRB. And that is what Hayes was referring to, this rewriting of that period. And at the heart of it, you see there 2 women, his daughter, Anna Johnson, who wrote as Ethna Carberry, and Alice Milligan. 2 of them had a number of magazines, Shan Van Vogt is one of them, which is a fascinating read. And also the fact that that Alice Milligan was a Methodist. And there was harboured in their hearts this hope that just as somehow or other in 1798, many Presbyterians and other Protestants had somehow become Republicans, as they saw. That in the same way, this aberration of Protestants by and large being unionist would be demolished. It's an aberration, it's temporary, we need to get back. And look, there's a good example. Alice Milligan, she's a member of Sinn Féin, and she was. You see that situation there where in 1898 the story was rewritten. And there was a fascination at that time with the exception and the exotic. This was. These were exceptions, these were the exotic, they were the unusual. But sometimes people get fascinated by that and miss out on the more normal. I've taught there about the period at the end of the 18th century. I just want to finish with two quotes. One, I bought the book last year, didn't get around to reading it at the time, but I've really been reading it carefully since. And it's from Crawford Gribben. And he makes some interesting points here. If I can get the right page for it here. He says this of the United Irishmen. The leaders of the United Irishmen were not able to agree upon much. As the society expanded throughout Ireland, it had become more politically, economically, and religiously diverse. Its leaders did not agree either on the ends to pursue or the optimal means of achieving them. Some combined enlightened political thinking with strongly anti-Catholic instincts. Drennan, for example, admitted that he didn't like the Catholic mind. It's a churlish soil, but it's the soil of Ireland that must be cultivated, or we must emigrate. For all that these ideologues claimed the mantle of enlightenment and thought like radicals, David A. Wilson has noted many of them felt like settlers. This lack of unity amongst their leaders explains why the United Irishmen made competing kinds of arguments. They valorized a secular democratic liberalism and nationalism that quickly became defined in racial and religious terms. He finishes off by actually saying, the one thing you can almost say for certain about them is that the United Irishmen were anything but united because they disagreed on so much. The movement's ambiguities and contradictions became evident. I think that's a really useful quote because it's a reminder of how it's much more complex. And maybe the revisionism of 1898 for a political purpose needs to be reviewed and reconsidered to try and get back more to what it originally was. And some of those ideas that Scottish teaching, Scottish thinking, Scottish Enlightenment brought to Ulster at that time. Thanks very much. That's actually excellent. Well, it's spot on at time. Our time is up, I gather, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy for a few minutes to try. And also, there's people who probably here who can do better than I can. Okay.
I think there might be confusion about pain. I think the so-called Quran of Belfast was the rights of man.
Yes.
Not the age of reason, which is a very different outrage law.
Yes. I know, I agree with that. I went through it. It's on archives, so you can read the entire memoirs and the diary. And if you stick in the word Quran, you don't find Quran of Belfast. But you're right, it was a reference to rights of man. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. But the one word you didn't mention was Freemasonry. Now, the Orange Order clearly drew heavily on that. A lot of the Enlightened Presbyterians in Belfast were Freemasons. The American Revolution was largely based in Freemasonry. What was the attitude of both the mainstream Presbyterian and non-subscribing Presbyterian churches? Because again, in the 19th century, certainly the Anglican Church and the mainstream non-conformists in England were all for it, and now it's totally beyond the pale.
That's a very good point. And obviously, William Drennan, when he came up with the idea of the United Irishmen, said it would be a brotherhood. Yeah. And it was modelled on Freemasonry and the lodges in the same way as the Orange Orders modelled on it, as the Defenders were modelled on it, and umpteen other organisations, every temperance organisation, the Independent Order of Good Templars, the Rechabites, all of these, everything was. Yes, that's in the more humorous way. Yes. So there's a structure there that now, what did people here think about? One of the points, of course, is Freemasonry hasn't always been the same necessarily as it is today. There was a period in the very early stage where it was actually Trinitarian in one stage. And then a Scottish minister got his fingers on it, hands on it, and it turned it into a supreme being instead of a Trinitarian God. I think that the view of churches was mixed, and the view of ministers would have been mixed. But there would not have been a particularly strong aversion to it at that time. I think that's true. A.T.Q. Stewart deals at length with the influence of Freemasonry on the United Irishmen. Membership of the lodges in Belfast, the Blue Lodge, and then the Orange Lodge, which was actually a Masonic lodge, but not an Orange Lodge. It was called the Orange one.
Although, sorry, to be fair, this idea of the supreme being means it was open. Indian Muslims and
yes,
were able to join in and promoted a sort of racial equality.
I understand your point,
and I'm not a Mason myself, by the way. So
okay. All I'm saying is that there was a change. I think it was the Reverend Anderson's the man who brought in a new system, and you ended up with hedge masons who then went off and became something else. And that's a story that I think it was Aiken McCausland wrote about at one time. But yes, there was certainly, and this idea that runs through Enlightenment thinking on the continent about deism and a much more liberal view of religion and how you accommodate it. It's a complex thing. It's interesting, but yes, you're right. There was an impact then. Yes.
Yeah, it's been very good, very enjoyed it, and we're talking about the complexities. I'm currently looking at the United Irishmen in South Ireland. We're Catholic Yeomen in Europe, we're Catholic Yeomen in Northern Water. Chesney down at Moan said there were Catholics in Presbyterians who wanted to join. So I think that's all very interesting. Now, your timeline in terms of starting with the Hamilton Montgomery, I would agree with that one, and I do agree that that's a very, very important one. To me, the Ulster-Scots, the Ulster-Irish goes back to the best time. And I think also an example in the late 16th century where Elizabeth I was doing her best to keep the Scots out of Ulster and wanted to expel them. And the statement was made at one point, and it changed in with something you said earlier. Somebody was worried that there were so many Scots coming at Ulster that Ulster was going to be another Scotland.
I referred passing just to the example of Columba and Patrick, but you're back to Trevena. It's been a constant factor, movement both ways all the time. I suppose the point about the Hamilton Montgomery is that it was the first organised. And it's back to Tom Devine's point, because they brought the women with them, they settled as families and they became, in that sense, a community. So it was more enduring rather than being absorbed in the way that which many, the Anglo-Normans have been absorbed in South End and places like that, right, around the coast here as well, but and others, but they somehow remained stubborn and thrown. But yes, it's a long connection in both directions. Okay, and we're last. Okay.
A.T.Q. Stewart has done a great deal of research, but his attitude to modern times is questionable. He says in his book, An Hour of Ground, historians of the future will be hard pressed to explain the eruption of violence in 1969. How can a historian say that?
When people get into issues around the past troubles and legacy, my attitude is I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it for a long time yet. There's an awful lot of untold stories of what happened in 66, 67, 68, and 69. Some really good stuff. Chris Reynolds from Nottingham Trent University did some work there on remembering that period and bringing together all the different views. I ended up on panels with people who were miles away from my position. A friend of mine was on the same panel with Bernadette Devlin and so on. It was bringing together all of those views. And it was interesting to hear what others experienced. I just make the point there. One in particular, whose father had been prominent in the Republican movement in Ardoyne, and my uncle was living in Bracey on the other side of the Crumlin Road, and took ages to get around to the few. Actually, the houses they were living in were exactly the same. The conditions were just as bad for one. There's all sorts of things. Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure. The man is dead now, so we can't go back and question him. Maybe he's sure. But it's stuff on the masonry element of the United Irishmen. I think the large thing. I forgot the name of the silence. Who can remember the name of the title? Oh, anyway, he wrote a very good book on that sole issue, really. Yeah. Okay, Stephen, and you're the last one.
Sorry, you touched on Skull of Oak there.
Yeah.
Okay. Just to say, in the writings of John Mark, he says that news hadn't spread the Ulster of Skull of Oak before Belfast. Also, Skull of Oak, when you went to the court martial right, it was provinces who were tried and convicted for hanging for Skull of Oak, which you never very rarely read or is mentioned.
Certainly, the it was the 5th of June, I think.
I think it was the 3rd.
Sorry?
I think it was the 3rd, I'm not sure.
I think the date I had was the 5th of June, I'm pretty sure. So it's virtually parallel to the things up here. But what it does, I think, is once it enters the folk memory, it's embedded there for a long time. Just the same as 1641 was embedded for a long time. The Siege of Derry still commemorates it. These big events do come in. I think there's been a great deal of rewriting and revisionism about Skull of Oak, and you get different writers who gather in the pages of the Irish Times and the news column there, letters column, and express conflicting views. You see people involved, I think, in a lot of revisionism elsewhere. Certainly it had an impact in terms of future hopes of it getting Presbyterian involvement in rebellion. That's all I would say. Thanks very much, folks, indeed, for coming, and I bid you good day.